Hey everybody, welcome back. So it's been like 3 weeks because I ended up having to take a week off of work to babysit my girlfriend's dog who got ran over by a car. I guess technically dog sit. Anyway, he's okay. He's just got like a fractured hip, but I just felt like it would be good to have somebody there all the time and I could afford to take the time off. Plus, I kind of wanted to take some time off anyway because I was starting to get a little burnt out. Speaking of burnt out, I'm still working on the diamonds mine area, which it seems an interminable thing, but they always kind of seem interminable, each of these areas, as I work through them. Um, and so I've been trying to kind of alternate between that and some other things, which I did mention in the last video as well. So let it be said, I guess, that I've been continuing to work on the diamonds mine, um, and I'll get a little bit into that later with kind of it's a little more of a technical topic of the week, but I think it's kind of interesting, at least in how it relates to what I'm doing in Taiji. It's a technical topic, but in any case, um, other than that, the thing that I've been working on is trying to get the save hitch to not happen or not be noticeable, because it's kind of impossible to save the game without there being some performance hit, but you don't really want that to be noticeable to the player. So if they're running around or whatever, you don't want the game to stutter. And presently it still does stutter, but I've done some work there to improve that. And actually, the work that I started on was kind of not the saving part, but I also save out a screenshot of the game whenever we save the game because I want to display it in the load game menu as a just an image so you can tell what save you're looking at, basically. So that ended up being, when I implemented that ended up being more of a performance hit than actually just saving the game itself. So it was like, okay, resolve the problem with the image saving before we move on to the actual save file stuff, which I still have not done. Unfortunately, I didn't save like a graph or even really some specs of what the performance difference between before and after was. But suffice to say, before that, that screenshot saving would go in excess of 33 milliseconds. So you would dip below 30 frames a second because of that screenshot being saved, and now it's just under 60 FPS, so 16 milliseconds. Now that is because of the regular saving is like just under 60 FPS, but sometimes it might go over, so I do want to get that down so that everything is okay. I don't know if I'm going to be able to eliminate stutters completely at like 120 frames per second, because even though I've moved the screenshot stuff over to like an asynchronous callback setup, it's still, there's some kind of hit there. I'm not sure why. It's got to be something internal to Unity, because as far as I can tell, I'm doing everything right, including writing out the JPEG as a separate thread from the main thread. But in any case, there's still a little bit of a hit there that's kind of always going to be there. Anyway, I'll be writing a written devlog post that goes more in depth on how I handled that, I guess you would say low impact. It's not really zero impact, but relatively low impact screenshot taking, because it's actually a thing that probably most games want to do in Unity, and it's not something that Unity really supports well out of the box. And Lord knows it took me like several days at least of research and work to get this as well as it's working. Um, and I've seen some other techniques online that are similar, but I think the one that I use is probably the fastest that I've seen. So that code could be useful. I don't know that I'll do much to package it up, but I probably will post it in there with the devlog post if other people want to look at it. Okay, so with that said, I wanted to move on to our kind of topic of the week, which is a little bit technical, a little bit not technical. I guess we got to do our topic of the week thing, or topic of the week. I don't know, however that goes. Uh, And really, it's kind of about world design, and particularly what I think is interesting in terms of open world game design. I think pretty much everybody agrees on these things, so it's not really there's not really a lot of debate about this, but I'm not going to state it as universal. I'm just going to say it's what I like about open world game design. And since Taiji is an open world game, I've tried to do some of these things in there. Unfortunately, and we'll get into kind of the technical thing, it's very difficult to do some of the things that I think work really well in open world games. So probably two of the big standout games that I can think of in terms of open world design and what I like about it is Dark Souls and The Witness. So both of those have very similar world design styles, although obviously the scale is very different. Dark Souls has much larger areas with less important space in it, but they both kind of follow a similar structure, which is that the world is relatively compact and highly vertical, with a lot of interconnections between areas that can kind of be secretly discovered. Um, so those are kind of like the two main things that I like about open world design when it's done well, is that compactness and the interconnectedness. So I think I've done a fairly good job on Taiji with the compactness. I've done less of a good job with the interconnectedness. And the reason is because it's very hard to interconnect a world in a 2D game unless you make it vertical. So unless you're kind of adding a faux 3D aspect to the game. It's much easier to do this in 3D because you can just place things on top of each other and then you can connect vertically. And I think the reason why it's so interesting to have these kind of vertical connections between areas in an open world game is because there's something about, like, psychologically, uh, the way in which we as humans process like vertical movement, um, which is that we're not very good at it. We're pretty good at judging distance, you know, for moving along the ground. We can tell, like, oh, that's been a long ways that we went. But vertically, we tend to exaggerate how much we've moved vertically. It feels like a lot. This may just be because we're kind of, I don't know, in the real world, maybe because we're processing the effort it took to get there. But in video games, a kind of a similar thing happens. And I think The Witness doesn't really exploit this for anything, but particularly Dark Souls 3 does this, where there's a point in the game, and I'm going to put a link here to a video like analyzing the world of Dark Souls 3 that kind of goes into depth into some of this stuff. But there's a point in the game where you basically travel down about 10 feet through the course of an area, but because the area is big and because the area has a very vertical presentation, when you when you leave that area, they can kind of, what they do is they fake that you've traveled, you know, like 1,000 feet down or something like that. And pretty much, I didn't notice this. This isn't like the infamous thing in Dark Souls 2 where you go into this windmill and you ride an elevator up and you end up inside of a volcano. um, that it's not like that at all. So it was totally not noticeable to me. So I think it's interesting the way in which, like, vertical space can trick you, and vertical movement can trick you. And I think in spite of the fact that there's no trickery happening in The Witness, there's really no trickery happening in Taiji. Um, like, I'm not lying to you about how much you're traveling, really. I still think that it's interesting, those vertical connections, because they're more surprising than like a horizontal connection. It can be surprising either way. I think a horizontal connection, at least in a 2D game, is really hard to make surprising, uh, because you need to disorient the player a little bit for them to not be aware of their proximity to, say, another area. Otherwise, it's just not much of a surprise. It's more of a, oh, I knew I could get over there, but I didn't know how I would be able to get over there or something like that. It's more the surprise is the way in which it's connected, not that it's connected. But with a 3D game, I think it's even possible to do that with horizontal space. You can kind of make the environment more maze-like or have less distinct landmarks or something, and you can travel horizontally a fair distance and then be kind of surprised about that you've ended up where you've started, right? In other words, it didn't seem like you were going in a loop or whatever. Anyway, that's just kind of the framing of the topic, I guess. And I think that that's interesting, but the hard part about doing this in Taiji is that trying to do some kind of pseudo 3D thing, which really just means that you have lots of layers, lots of two-dimensional layers of the world. And there's really nowhere in the game that I've done this more extremely as the Diamond's Mine area. And that's part of why the Diamond's Mine has taken so long. And so I've kind of learned that it's very hard to get this type of effect working in some kind of way that's not extremely labor intensive in a 2D game, because that plateau that's next to the Diamond's Mine, essentially you've got the top layer, then you've got a first layer inside of that plateau, then you've got a second layer in the middle, then you've got a third layer down at the bottom, and then also you have the kind of interior of that crater, and that's addition to the exterior of the crater if you're on top of the crater, which is sort of connected to the top of the plateau, but not really, because there's certain parts of that need to fade out while the top of the plateau stays intact if you're down inside of the crater area of the Diamond's Mine. Anyway, it could be a little bit spoilerish in terms of showing the video here, but I guess I have to have something to demonstrate what I'm saying, otherwise it sounds extremely abstract. But doing that is extremely labor intensive, because you pretty much, for every single cutaway into this area, you have to hand kind of author the art for that cutaway. It's not like a 3D game where it's just a different space that's below that you walk into. Because it's a 2D top-down game, you have to be able to see into that space through the areas that were on top of it, so it has to actually like cut away. A easier way to achieve this would be to do some kind of system for the game where you can't see very far, so you can't actually see everything. It's sort of like a fog of war type system. There's a game that's actually doing this type of thing that's, I think, very interesting and worth keeping an eye on. I don't remember the name of it right now, but I'm going to put a little bubble here, or here, whichever makes sense, that shows what that game is. But that's a good example, I think, of maybe a better way to achieve that type of world interconnectedness in what's essentially a 2D game. I think in this case it's isometric, but very hard to do if everything's visible, if you keep everything visible, because then you have to cut away. You're not just like fading into a black abyss, kind of like the Super Nintendo Zelda game, or any number of 2D games that have done that, where you go into an interior and then it's kind of like a separate space and you've just got black around it. I didn't want to do that because I wanted it to have a more direct feeling of being kind of a 3D space, but in retrospect, I think it's probably good that I haven't had too many areas that have this level of verticality, because it is so labor intensive and it takes so long to get those things done and working in the game and iron out all the glitches, so that, because it's very hard to think about when you have 5 different layers, what things are going to be visible at what time. I could have maybe made a more robust system to accomplish this, thinking about it in retrospect, but the system that I have works okay and well enough, and I haven't really done this that much in the game, and I think probably anywhere else that I'm going to do it is going to be more, I guess I would say, planned out, because part of what was difficult about doing this cutaway for this area was that it involved the plateau area as well as the dice puzzles area, both of which had been done before I kind of decided how exactly I wanted all this to work. Um, so it required a lot of like retrofitting old areas into the kind of this new structure to get it to work. Anyway, that's a rambly way to put it. I guess it didn't end up being that technical, but it's still it's still maybe in the nitty gritty. But I thought it was kind of interesting and just interesting to talk about like what I like about open world design and how I'm trying to integrate that into Taiji, even though the structure of the game is really a challenge, and I've kind of learned why there's not that many top-down 2D games that do the combination of things that I've chose to do. Um, you know, try to have an interconnected world, open world, no load times, and no cheating, right? No just putting you in a black room uh, so that we can do whatever on an interior. Anyway, hopefully that was interesting and a little bit of a dive into some of what I've been doing. And as I said, I'll be writing a devlog post that goes into a bit more depth on the save load speed up stuff that I did because I think it's a little interesting. With that said, I will see you all in 2 weeks, I believe. Until then, like the video, subscribe to the channel. You know the drill. And thanks for watching. I'll see you around, guys. And gals, I'll see you around.